The sun was not a friend in Arizona. In the year of our Lord 1876, it was a hammer, beating the cracked earth until it broke into a million fissures. It baked the color from the sky, leaving a pale, hazy blue that offered no comfort. Dust, fine as red flour, was the territory's only crop, and it rose in ghost clouds with every gust of wind, coating the tongue, stinging the eyes, and burying the world in a shroud of grit. This was a land of thirst and long shadows, a place where the bones of forgotten ambitions lay bleaching under the endless sky. Along a track that was more suggestion than road, a single wagon groaned its way toward the promise of Silver Mesa. The canvas top, bleached near white, offered little reprieve from the heat that radiated upwards from the sand and downwards from the heavens. Abigail Whitaker sat beside her father, her hands folded in the lap of her plain calico dress, a film of pink dust settling in the fine lines of her knuckles. At 22, she possessed a composure that seemed ill-suited for such a landscape. Her late mother, a woman who had carried a love for Byron's poetry all the way from Boston to this desolate edge of the world, had taught her that stillness was a form of strength. But the verses that Abigail recited in her mind, verses of rain-swept English hills and tumultuous seas, felt like a foreign language here. They were words from a world made of water and green, not ash and dust. Her father, Dr. Samuel Whitaker, held the reins with a loose but steady grip. He was a man well into his 50s, his face a roadmap of worry and kindness etched by years of tending to the ailments of prospectors, soldiers, and settlers. His shoulders were stooped with a permanent weariness, but his eyes, when they met his daughter's, were clear and resolute. He hated the violence of this land, the casual cruelty that bloomed as easily as the prickly pear, yet he believed his work was a necessary penance, a small weight on the scales of justice. They were returning from a supply run to a remote mining encampment, their wagon now carrying little more than empty laudanum bottles, spent bandages, and 2 weary souls. The silence between them was a comfortable one, filled only by the rhythmic squeak of the axles and the plodding of the 2 tired horses. Every few minutes, the doctor would pass a canteen to Abigail, and she would take a small, measured sip before handing it back. Water was life, and they measured it out in precious drops. The attack came with the suddenness of a lightning strike from a cloudless sky. There was no warning, just the thunder of hooves from a dry wash to their right and the raw yell of men whose voices were parched with malice. 4 riders, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas, swarmed the wagon. They were not soldiers or lawmen. They were hard, lean men with the dead-eyed look of vultures. Dr. Whitaker pulled back on the reins, his voice calm but firm. "We have nothing of value. The medicine has been delivered." The lead rider, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "We ain't here for your pills, old man." Before Abigail could fully process the terror, 2 of the men had seized the horses' bridles, bringing the wagon to a shuddering halt. Her father was pulled from his seat and thrown to the ground with a grunt of pain. Abigail cried out, scrambling to go to him, but a rough hand clamped down on her arm, holding her fast. "Let him go," she pleaded, her voice trembling but sharp. "He is an old man." The man holding her simply grinned, his teeth stained and crooked. The leader walked over to her father, who was pushing himself onto his elbows, his hat knocked from his head. He nudged the doctor with the toe of his boot. "You've been wandering too far. Doc, poking your nose where it ain't wanted. Some folks don't like that." Samuel Whitaker looked up, his face grim. "I go where people are sick, that is all." The man shrugged. "Just a message." The next few moments were a blur of calculated destruction. The men worked with a chilling efficiency. They did not ransack the wagon for valuables. They unhitched the horses, slapping their rumps to send them galloping off into the shimmering heat. Then, while 2 men held the doctor and Abigail at gunpoint, the other 2 took axes from their saddlebags and methodically smashed the water barrels lashed to the side of the wagon. The sound of splintering wood was followed by the dark, spreading stain of water sinking uselessly into the thirsty sand. It was the sound of a death sentence. They took the canteens, pouring the last of their contents onto the ground with theatrical slowness. The man with the scar tipped his hat to Abigail with a mock courtesy before they mounted up and rode away, their laughter swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. They were left with nothing, no horses, no water, and miles of sun-hammered wasteland between them and Silver Mesa. The first hour was spent in shocked silence. The second was spent with hope, a desperate belief that another traveler would soon be along. By the third hour, hope had begun to shrivel and crack like the mud beneath their feet. The sun climbed to its zenith, a merciless white eye in the sky. Abigail tore strips from a spare petticoat, fashioning a makeshift turban for her father and herself. But it did little to stop the relentless heat. Her father's medical training gave their predicament a terrible clarity. He knew precisely how the body would betray them the thickening of the tongue, the fire in the throat, the dizzying headache that would curdle into delirium. He tried to keep their spirits up, speaking of past times, of Abigail's mother, but his voice grew raspy, the words catching in his dry throat. Abigail watched him, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. He was not a young man. This land was hard on the strong and unforgiving to the weak. She felt a surge of rage at the men who had done this. It was not robbery. It was murder, just stretched out over hours instead of seconds. The senselessness of it gnawed at her. Why? By late afternoon, her father had stopped talking. He sat slumped against a wagon wheel, his breathing shallow. Abigail's own head pounded with a dull, insistent rhythm. Her lips were cracked, and every swallow was an agony. The world had begun to tilt and shimmer at the edges. She closed her eyes and saw an image of her mother, sitting in a rocking chair by a window, reading from a leather-bound book. "She walks in beauty, like the night," her mother's voice whispered in her memory, and the irony brought a dry, painful sob to Abigail's throat. There was no beauty here, only a slow, granular surrender to the dust. She thought they were already dead when she first saw him. A figure, walking out of the heat haze, as if born from the rippling air itself. He was not a mirage, she realized, for he moved with a purpose that hallucinations lacked. He was tall and lean, moving with a lithe grace that seemed to mock the punishing terrain. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt, his black hair tied back from a face that was all sharp angles and stoic composure. He carried a rifle in one hand and a waterskin over his shoulder. He was Navajo. Every instinct, every whispered prejudice and cautionary tale she had ever heard screamed at her to be afraid. The townspeople of Silver Mesa spoke of the Navajo with a mixture of fear and contempt. Savages. They called them raiders. Less than human. Yet, as he drew closer, she felt no menace from him, only a profound and unnerving stillness. He stopped a dozen feet from them, his dark eyes taking in the scene with a quick, comprehensive glance, the unhitched wagon, the smashed barrels, the two figures huddled in the scant shade. His expression did not change. He had seen this before. He approached Abigail first, his steps silent on the sandy earth. He unslung the waterskin and held it out to her. She stared at it, her mind slow to connect the offer with her overwhelming need. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt a jolt, as if from a static charge. His skin was warm, firm, real. She drank, the water a miracle on her tongue. It was cool and clean, tasting of earth and life. She wanted to drain the entire skin, but she stopped herself, handing it to her father. The man watched her, his gaze unreadable. He then knelt by Dr. Whitaker, helping the older man drink, his movements gentle and surprisingly deft. When they had both drunk their fill, he spoke. His voice was low, with a cadence that was foreign to her ears. Yet the English was clear. "Who did this?" Abigail found her voice, though it was a cracked whisper. "4 men, They took the horses and the water. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the tracks around the wagon. His gaze lingered on the axe marks in the barrel staves. White men. It was a statement, not a question. Abigail could only nod in return. He straightened up, his attention still on the surrounding desert, as if listening to something she could not hear. "You are a long way from any town. You will not make it on foot." "We are from Silver Mesa," her father managed to say. "I am the doctor there." The Navajo man's eyes flickered toward him, a brief, almost imperceptible spark of interest. Then his face settled back into its impassive mask. He looked at the sun, now beginning its slow descent toward the western mesas. He seemed to be weighing his options, and for a terrifying moment, Abigail thought he might simply turn and walk away, leaving them to the fate the bandits had intended. He owed them nothing. In the cruel calculus of the West, they were not his people. Their troubles were not his concern. But he did not leave. He slung the waterskin over his shoulder again. "I am Kiona. I will take you to the edge of the town." The gratitude that washed over Abigail was so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling pitifully small. "We would not have—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Kiona gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He seemed to accept her thanks as he would accept the rising of the sun as a simple fact, requiring no comment. He helped her father to his feet, supporting him as the older man swayed. The journey was a waking dream. Kiona led them away from the useless wagon, his pace steady and unhurried. He seemed to know the land as intimately as she knew the lines of a sonnet. He led them through arroyos and across plains of sun-baked stone, always finding the path of least resistance. As dusk bled across the sky in hues of orange and violet, he found a small spring, hidden in a cleft of rock, that she and her father would have walked past without a second glance. The water was clean and cold. They rested there as night fell, the desert air cooling rapidly. Kiona built a small, smokeless fire from dry mesquite, the flames a welcome flicker of life in the immense, star-filled darkness. He offered them jerky from a pouch at his belt. It was tough and salty, but it was food, and it quieted the ache in Abigail's stomach. She watched him across the small fire. He sat with his back straight, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze constantly moving, scanning the darkness. He was a man wrapped in a profound solitude. There was a weariness about him, a sorrow in the lines of his face that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He had told them his name, Kiona, but it was like being given a single stone from a mountain. It told her nothing of the man himself. Her gratitude warred with a lifetime of ingrained assumptions. This was a man her society deemed a savage, a heathen, yet he had shown them a quiet, pragmatic compassion that felt more civilized than anything she had known in Silver Mesa. He had saved their lives. The knowledge was a heavy, unsettling weight in her mind. It forced her to look at him, truly look at him, not as a type, but as a man. And she was not sure what to make of what she saw. A deep, unsettling feeling began to stir within her, a recognition that the simple world of right and wrong, of civilized and savage, that she had been taught, was perhaps a lie, and in the heart of the Arizona desert, under a blanket of unfamiliar stars, that thought was more terrifying than any bandit. They saw the first rooftops of Silver Mesa swim into view with the gray light of dawn. The town was a collection of raw lumber and wishful thinking, huddled against a backdrop of red rock mesas that looked like the monuments of a forgotten race of giants. To Abigail, after the emptiness of the desert, it should have looked like a haven. Instead, a sense of deep foreboding settled over her. The world had felt clean and honest under the stars, governed by the simple laws of thirst and survival. This world of men felt tangled and treacherous. Kiona stopped at the crest of a low rise, about a half-mile from the town's edge. His part of the bargain was done. "I will leave you here," he said, his voice as flat and dispassionate as it had been from the start. "The town is not a safe place for my people." Before Dr. Whitaker could offer proper thanks, The sound of approaching horses reached them. 3 riders, kicking up a plume of morning dust. The man in the lead was barrel-chested and wore a silver star pinned to his vest. His face was fleshy and sunburnt, and his small, watchful eyes missed nothing. It was Sheriff Brant Cole. "Well now, look what the cat dragged in," Cole said, his voice a low drawl that held no welcome. He reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the exhausted doctor and his daughter before settling on Kiona. "And he brought a friend. This man saved our lives." "Sheriff," Dr. Whitaker said, his voice still hoarse, "we were attacked, left for dead. He brought us here." Cole's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something cold and calculating in their depths. "Attacked? You say?" He dismounted, his movements heavy and deliberate. He walked around Kiona in a slow circle, looking him over like a piece of livestock. "Funny thing, we found a dead man out near the old rail spur this morning, a soldier from the fort. Looks like he had a run-in with some trouble." Abigail's heart went cold. She saw the trap being laid before the jaws had even snapped shut. "That has nothing to do with him," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "He was with us. He found us yesterday afternoon." Cole stopped his circling and gave her a thin, humorless smile. "Did he now? Missy, a man can cover a lot of ground in a night." He turned back to Kiona. "What is your name?" "Boy." Kiona stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not answer. His silence seemed to infuriate the sheriff more than any protest could have. "Not much for talking?" Are you? Cole's hand shot out and grabbed the front of Kiona's shirt. "We got ways of making people talk in Silver Mesa." He shoved Kiona toward one of his deputies. "Lock him up. We will sort this out later." "Wait," Dr. Whitaker protested, stepping forward. "You cannot just arrest him. He is the reason we are alive. He is a good man." Cole turned to face the doctor, his smile gone. "A good man, he is a Navajo. And right now, he is the only suspect I have got in the murder of a United States soldier." He pointed a thick finger at the doctor. "I would advise you to go home. Samuel, you and the girl, get some water and keep your opinions to yourselves. This is official business." The deputies bound Kiona's hands with a length of rope. They were rough, shoving him forward. Throughout it all, Kiona did not struggle or speak. He held his head high, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if the town and the men in it were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, a bad dream from which he would eventually awaken. As they led him away, his eyes met Abigail's for a fleeting second. There was no plea for help, no fear. There was only a vast, profound contempt. The law in Silver Mesa was dispensed from a squat stone building that served as both the sheriff's office and the town jail. It smelled of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair. Abigail stood outside it for a long time the next day, a wooden bucket of clean water in her hand. The town was buzzing with the news. A soldier murdered, a Navajo savage in the jail cell. Justice would be swift, they said. It always was. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that Kiona was innocent. The accusation was too convenient, the sheriff's actions too quick. It was a lie, stitched together from fear and hatred. Her father had tried to reason with Cole, but the sheriff had dismissed him, saying he had an eyewitness who saw Kiona near the body. No one in town questioned it. The story fit too neatly into their established view of the world. Taking a deep breath, Abigail pushed open the door. A deputy with a drooping mustache looked up from a tattered dime novel, his chair tilted back against the wall. "What do you want?" he grunted. "She is with me," a voice said from the inner office. Sheriff Cole appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. "Let her through." He gave Abigail a look that was part appraisal and part warning. "Come to see our guest." "I brought him some water," she said, holding the bucket up slightly. "It is the least I can do." Cole considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just do not get too close. He bites." He gestured with his head toward the back, where 2 cells stood in the gloom. The deputy led her to the cells, Kiona was in the one on the right. He was sitting on a narrow cot, his back against the stone wall. The dim light from a high, barred window cast stripes of shadow across his face. He looked up as she approached, his expression unchanged. She set the bucket down just outside the bars. "I am sorry," she said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "For this—" Kiona said nothing. He simply watched her, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through her, seeing all the fear and confusion she felt. "I know you did not do it," she continued, her voice a near whisper. "My father and I, we will tell them. We will make them listen." His lips twisted into something that might have been the ghost of a bitter smile. "Your words mean nothing here," he said, his voice low and raspy. "In this town, the only thing that matters is the color of a man's skin." He rose from the cot and came to the bars, moving with that same fluid grace she remembered from the desert. He was not a large man, but in the confines of the cell, he seemed to radiate a coiled energy, a sense of power held in check. He looked at the bucket of water, then back at her. His gaze was intense, searching. For the first time, she did not feel the sting of his contempt or the chill of his indifference. She saw something else, something deeper, a flicker of weary acknowledgement. He dipped a tin cup into the bucket and drank, his throat working. When he was done, he looked at her again, and the brief connection was gone. The mask of stoicism firmly back in place. She visited again the next day, and the day after that. She brought water and sometimes a piece of bread she had saved from her own meal. Mostly. He was silent, but on the third day, as she was about to leave, he spoke. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Because you saved my father and me. It is a debt." "It is more than that," he stated, his eyes fixed on her. "You look at me, and you do not see what the others see. Why?" "Because I am not a fool," she answered simply. "I see a man who showed us mercy when he had no reason to." He was quiet for a long time, studying her face in the gloom. Then he began to speak, his voice a low, level monotone, as if he were reciting a long, memorized history. He told her of his childhood, in a place of tall pines and a river that ran clear and cold. He spoke of the bluecoats, the soldiers who came and burned their homes and fields. He told her of the long walk, the forced march of his people across hundreds of miles of desert to a place called Bosque Redondo. It was a prison camp, he said, a place of starvation and sickness, where the government tried to turn his people into farmers on land that would not even grow weeds. "My mother died on the walk," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My little sister died of a fever in the first winter. My father was killed by a guard because he would not kneel. They took everything from us, our land, our families, our spirits. They left us with nothing but the memory of what it was to be free." Abigail listened, her heart aching with a sorrow so vast it felt like it might break her. The history she had been taught in school, a history of brave pioneers and manifest destiny, was a lie. She was seeing the other side of the story, written in the blood and tears of a people whose only crime was to exist. This was the source of the sorrow she had seen in his eyes. He was a survivor of a war she had not even known was being fought. He fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the stale air between them. "Now you know," he said. "The men who left you to die in the sun, they are the sons of the men who did that to my people. It is the same sickness." A few days later, Sheriff Cole sent a deputy to summon her and her father to his office. The room was neat, a stark contrast to the filth of the jail cells. A large map of the territory was pinned to one wall, marked with circles and lines in black ink. Cole was sitting behind his desk, cleaning a pistol. He did not invite them to sit. "Samuel," he began, his tone friendly, almost paternal. "I have been looking over some land deeds and survey maps. A new water concern is coming to the area. Big plans." He gestured vaguely at the map. "It seems the spot where you had your little bit of trouble falls right inside the proposed boundaries for a new reservoir." Dr. Whitaker frowned. "I do not see what that has to do with us." Well, it is private property. You see, and you were there without permission. One might even say you were trespassing. Prospecting for water. Perhaps that is a serious offense. It could mean fines, even jail time, especially for a man who is supposed to set an example for the community. Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. She could see where this was going. "What do you want?" Brant Dr. Whitaker asked. His voice tired. Cole set the pistol down and leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "The trial for the Navajo is in 2 days. The circuit judge is coming through, and it would be a shame to add another case to his docket. A real shame. Now, my witness is a little shaky. A drunk prospector. A jury might not believe him. But if a respectable young lady like your daughter were to take the stand," he let the sentence hang in the air. "If she were to testify that she saw the Navajo lurking around where the soldier was found," he continued, his voice soft and persuasive, "that he seemed agitated, maybe had blood on his hands, just a few simple words, the jury would believe her, and this whole ugly business would be over. The Navajo would hang, as he surely deserves. And I would be inclined to forget all about any trespassing charges against a certain town doctor." The room was silent. Abigail could hear the ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against her conscience. It was a simple, brutal choice. Tell a lie, a small lie that everyone in town already believed was the truth, and her father would be safe. The world would go on as it always had, or she could refuse, and watch the only family she had left be crushed by the corrupt power of this man. Cole smiled, seeing the struggle in her face. "You do what is right for your family, Abigail. That is the only law that matters out here. You think about it." They walked home in a fog of unspoken misery. Her father, a man who had dedicated his life to healing, looked broken. He did not tell her what to do. He did not have to. She knew her duty was to protect him. That night, she sat by her window, looking out at the dark, silent mesas. She thought of Kiona, sitting in his cell, a man who had lost everything but his own unyielding dignity. He had told her his father had died because he would not kneel. And now, Brant Cole was asking her to kneel. He was asking her to trade one man's life for her father's security, to become a part of the same sickness that had destroyed Kiona's world. She thought of the water he had given her in the desert, a simple act of grace that had saved her life. Now she was being asked to offer him a cup of poison in return. Her mother's books of poetry lay on her bedside table, filled with stories of honor and truth and love. They felt like relics from another world. The choice was hers alone, to speak or not to speak, to save her father by damning an innocent man, or to honor the truth and risk everything. The silence of the desert night pressed in on her, and in that silence, she made her decision. It was her first act of true rebellion, a quiet, internal declaration of war against the town of Silver Mesa and everything it stood for. She would not speak the lie. She would be silent, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that her silence would be the loudest sound in the courtroom. The night before the circuit judge was due to arrive, a restless wind kicked up from the south, carrying the scent of distant rain and the grit of the high desert. It rattled the windows of the small house Abigail shared with her father, a mournful sound that echoed the turmoil in her own soul. Sleep was an impossibility. Her decision to remain silent was a stone in her gut, heavy and cold. But she knew that silence alone would not save Kiona. It would only condemn her father. Cole would see to that. There was only one path left, a trail leading away from the pretense of law and into the honest brutality of the wilderness. She moved in the deepest hour of the night, a shadow in her own home. She took a small sack and filled it with what little they had: a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and the small pouch of coins her father kept in a lockbox. She took his medical bag, stuffing it with bandages, carbolic acid, and a bottle of laudanum. Lastly, she took the revolver he kept in his bedside table. The weapon felt alien in her hand. a cold and heavy piece of iron that had no place in her world. She had never fired a gun in her life. She tucked it into the sack, hoping she would never have to. Her father was asleep in his chair, his face etched with worry even in slumber. She touched his shoulder gently. He awoke with a start, his eyes wide with confusion. She put a finger to her lips, her voice a bare whisper. "We have to go, now?" He understood immediately. There was no argument, only a sad, weary resignation in his eyes. He knew what Cole was capable of. He knew what Abigail's silence in court would cost them. He nodded, his movements slow and pained, and followed her out into the whispering darkness. The livery stable was at the far end of town, a place of shadows and the warm smell of hay and horses. Abigail had a plan. Desperate and thin as a spider's thread, she had saved 2 of her mother's silver dollars, coins her father had told her to keep for an emergency. This, she reasoned, was that emergency. She slipped into the stable, her heart hammering against her ribs. A young boy was asleep on a pile of straw. The stable hand. She nudged him awake, pressing the coins into his hand. She told him she needed the 2 horses her father kept there, saddled and ready, and she needed him to forget he had ever seen her. The boy's eyes, wide in the lantern light, flickered from the silver in his palm to the desperation in her face. He nodded, his greed and perhaps a sliver of pity overriding his fear of the sheriff. While the boy worked, Abigail found a length of rope and a full water skin. She gathered a sack of oats and a spare blanket. Every sound, the jingle of a harness, the soft nicker of a horse, seemed as loud as a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She expected the door to be thrown open at any moment, to see Sheriff Cole's face illuminated in the lantern light. But no one came. They led the horses out the back and met her father in a dark alleyway. Getting him into the saddle was a slow, difficult process. He was not a young man, and the ordeal in the desert had taken a greater toll than he had let on. As they made their way out of town, keeping to the shadows, Abigail's mind raced. How could she help Kiona? She could not just ride away and leave him to his fate. As they passed the jail, she slid from her horse. She handed the reins of both her mount and the pack horse to her father. She told him to ride to the old cottonwood tree by the dry creek bed, a mile out of town, and wait for her. If she was not there by sunrise, he was to keep riding east. He protested, his voice a low, urgent plea, but she was resolute. She said she owed a debt. She crept to the back of the jail. The high barred window of Kiona's cell was a dark square against the stone. It was too high to reach. She looked around, frantic, and saw a stack of old wooden crates behind the blacksmith shop next door. They were heavy, but she managed to drag and stack 2 of them, creating a precarious platform. She climbed onto it, her breath catching in her throat. She could see him inside, a dark shape sitting on the cot. She hissed his name, a sound like a snake in the dust. "Kiona." He was on his feet in an instant, a silent shadow at the bars. There was no surprise in his posture, only a tense readiness. She spoke in a rush, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic whisper. She told him about the horses, the supplies, about the meeting place at the cottonwood tree. She held up the rope. The window was too narrow for him to pass through, but the bars were old and set in crumbling mortar. He looked at the bars, then at her. He gave a single, sharp nod. He told her to leave the rope and go. Now. She did as he said, her heart a wild bird in her chest. She scrambled down, leaving the rope hanging near the window, and ran, her footsteps muffled by the dusty street. She did not look back. Reaching her father felt like crossing an ocean. The minutes stretched into an eternity. They waited, hidden in the deep shadows of the cottonwood. As the sky began to bleed from black to a deep, bruised purple, the silence was absolute. She began to fear the worst, that she had been seen, that Kiona had been caught. Then they heard it. Not a sound, but a feeling, a presence. He emerged from the darkness without a whisper of warning, moving with the silence of an owl. How he had broken the bars and escaped the town without raising an alarm, she did not know. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and a fierce, burning intensity in his eyes. He took the reins of the pack horse from her father without a word, his movements economical and precise. He looked at them both, his gaze lingering for a moment on the doctor's weary face. Then he turned his horse and led them north, into the labyrinth of canyons and mesas that was his home. They rode for hours, pushing the horses hard. Kiona set a relentless pace, never looking back, his body a straight line of purpose in the saddle. By mid-morning, they heard the baying of hounds. Cole was faster than she had anticipated. Panic flared in Abigail's chest, hot and sharp. Kiona showed no fear. He led them off the main trail, into a narrow, winding canyon where the horses' hooves made little sound on the slick rock. The pursuit grew louder, then faded, then grew louder again as the posse cast about for their trail. They were gaining. Suddenly, Kiona reined in his horse. He pointed to a steep, rocky incline ahead. He told Abigail to take her father and climb. She was to keep going until she found a place to hide. He would meet them there. As she helped her father from his horse, a shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. The bullet ricocheted off the rock near her head, showering her with stone chips. Her father cried out and slumped against her, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He had been hit. Another shot kicked up dust at their feet. The posse was closer now, just around the bend. Terror gave Abigail a strength she did not know she possessed. She half dragged, half carried her father up the rocky slope, scrambling for purchase, her lungs burning. The horses, spooked by the gunfire, bolted back down the canyon. She did not see what Kiona did. She only heard there were 3 more shots from the posse's rifles, but there was no answering shot from Kiona. Instead, there was a strange, sharp, thrumming sound, followed by a choked cry, then another, and then a scream of terror and the sound of a horse falling. After that, there was only silence, broken by the moaning of the wind. She found a shallow overhang, a small cave worn into the side of the mesa, and eased her father down. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. She tore open his shirt. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, but he was losing blood, and the shock of the wound was severe. She worked quickly, her fear replaced by a cold, clear focus, using the supplies from the medical bag to clean and bandage the wound as best she could. Kiona appeared at the mouth of the cave an hour later. He was unhurt. In his hand, he carried a bow, beautifully crafted from a single piece of wood, and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. He had taken them from the men below. He did not speak of what had happened. He did not have to. She had seen his work. He had used the canyon, the rocks, the very earth itself as a weapon. He was not just a man. He was a part of this land. And in this land, he was king. He had met the posse's modern rifles with ancient skill and had won. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. For 2 days, they stayed hidden in the cave as a fierce windstorm howled outside, filling the air with a blinding, choking storm of red dust. It was a world reduced to the confines of their small shelter. Abigail tended to her father, who drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. His wound was not fatal, but it was serious. And without proper rest and care, it could easily become so. In the long hours, she watched Kiona. He sat near the mouth of the cave, a silent sentinel, his gaze fixed on the swirling curtain of dust. He seemed to need no sleep, no food, no comfort. He was like the rock around them, patient and enduring. The storm that raged outside seemed to be a reflection of the storm he carried within himself. On the second night, the fever broke, and her father fell into a deep, healing sleep. The wind had died down, and the world was quiet again. A small fire Kiona had built from hoarded wood crackled near the back of the cave, its light pushing back the immense darkness of the desert night. The flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, a tiny beacon of warmth and life in the vast, cold emptiness. Abigail sat huddled in a blanket, watching the flames. She was exhausted, body and soul, but for the first time since leaving Silver Mesa, she did not feel afraid. She felt a strange sense of peace. She looked over at Kiona, who was still keeping his vigil. She asked him how he knew they would come after them so quickly. His answer was simple. He said Cole was not a lawman. He was a thief. He wanted the land, the water. The murdered soldier was just an excuse. Their wagon had been attacked not as a warning, but to clear them out of the way. He had seen it from the tracks. It was the work of hired men, not common bandits. He had known from the beginning that Cole wanted him dead, not for a crime he had committed, but for a crime he had witnessed. She looked at this man, this supposed savage, who understood the corrupt hearts of so-called civilized men better than she ever had. He had fought for them, protected them, led them to this fragile sanctuary. In his world, honor was not something you talked about in a courtroom. It was something you lived, every moment of every day. It was a code of survival, of protecting those in your care, of meeting violence with a swift and terrible efficiency. She was seeing the man behind the mask of silence, a man forged in the fires of immense loss, and she felt a new, unfamiliar emotion begin to bloom in the ashes of her old life. It was a fragile seed of trust, a tiny light flickering in the great and terrible darkness, as precious and as vulnerable as their small campfire against the vast and unforgiving desert. When the dust storm finally blew itself out, it left behind a world scoured clean and silent. The air was cool and sharp, and the sky was a deep, startling blue. Kiona rose and looked out from the mouth of the cave, his gaze sweeping the horizon with an unnerving intensity. He said the men would come back, and next time they would bring more than hounds. The cave was a trap, not a shelter. They had to move. Dr. Whitaker was weak, but the fever had passed, and he was steady enough to ride, leaning forward in the saddle. Kiona had managed to find two of the posse's horses, which had scattered during the fight, and he led them deeper into the maze of rock and shadow, traveling on paths that were invisible to Abigail's eyes. He spoke little, but there was a new urgency in his movements, a sense that they were racing against a closing window of time. After half a day's ride, they came to a place that made the hair on Abigail's arm stand on end. It was the ruin of a fort, its adobe walls crumbling back into the earth from which they had been made. A watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the sky, and the parade ground was a sea of weeds and blowing sand. The flagstaff was a bare pole, stripped of its colors, a silent monument to a forgotten authority. Kiona stopped the horses at the gateway, the great wooden doors long since rotted from their hinges. He stared at the desolate compound, and for the first time, Abigail saw his composure crack. A look of profound pain, a deep and ancient grief, passed over his face. He seemed to be looking not at the ruins, but at the ghosts that inhabited them. "This place is called Fort Defiance by the soldiers," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "My people call it by another name. We call it the place of suffering." He explained that this was one of the outposts where his people had been herded like cattle before the Long Walk. He had been a boy of 12 when the Bluecoats had brought him here, his hands bound. He had spent a winter within these very walls. The knowledge settled over Abigail like a shroud. He had not brought them to a sanctuary. He had brought them into the heart of his own nightmare because it was the only place he knew where they might be safe. They made a camp in what had once been the commander's quarters, a small building with a partially intact roof that offered shelter from the sun and the wind. Dr. Whitaker, exhausted from the journey, lay down on a blanket and was soon asleep. A profound and heavy silence filled the fort, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the empty barracks. Restless, Abigail left her father's side and began to wander through the ruins. She felt like an intruder, a trespasser on holy yet desecrated ground. She walked into one of the long, low buildings that had served as the barracks. The air inside was thick with the dust of decay and memory. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating floating motes of dust like tiny, wandering spirits. The walls were made of plaster over adobe brick, and they were covered in markings. At first, she thought it was meaningless graffiti, but as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw that they were names, hundreds of names, scratched into the plaster with nails or sharp stones. Hashi, Denali, Yiska, Nijoni. Below some of the names were dates and crude drawings of the sun, of birds, of running horses. It was a litany of the lost, a final, desperate testament from people who had been stripped of everything but their own identity. She reached out and traced one of the names with her fingertips, the plaster cool and gritty against her skin. She remembered Kiona's voice in the jail cell, telling her of his family. She imagined a young boy, hungry and cold, scratching his father's name, his mother's name, his sister's name into this wall. A final act of remembrance before being marched away to a place from which they would never return. The abstract history he had shared with her was no longer a story. It was real. The proof was here, etched into the very bones of this place. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and silent, for the ghosts of the fort, and for the living ghost who had brought her here. The attack came after nightfall, with the sudden eruption of gunfire that ripped the darkness to shreds. Cole had found them. Muzzle flashes lit up the parade ground from 3 different directions. They were surrounded. Kiona was instantly in motion. He shoved Abigail and her father, who had been startled awake. "To the floor! Stay down!" he commanded, his voice a low growl. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the quarters, splintering wood and kicking up clouds of dust. He crawled to the window, his bow in his hand, and loosed an arrow into the night. A scream answered him. "They are trying to flush us out," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "They will try to burn the roof." He was right. Moments later, a flaming torch arced through the air and landed on the dry timbers of the roof. The fire caught quickly, the flames licking hungrily at the ancient wood. Smoke began to fill the small room, thick and acrid. "We have to move," Kiona said. He pointed to a low wall at the back of the compound, part of the old stables. "If we can get there, we will have better cover." It was a desperate gamble. They would have to cross 20 yards of open ground, illuminated by the growing fire. "I will go first," Kiona said. "I will draw their fire. When I do, you take your father and run. Do not stop. Do not look back." Before Abigail could protest, he was gone, a fleeting shadow slipping out the back door. A volley of shots immediately followed him, the bullets thudding into the wall where he had been a second before. He was shouting now, a Navajo war cry that was both terrifying and magnificent, drawing the attention of Cole's men. "Now, Abigail," her father urged, pulling her to her feet. "Go now." She grabbed his hand, and they ran, stumbling through the darkness, their lungs searing with smoke. The air was filled with the roar of the fire and the crack of rifles. They were halfway to the stables when her father cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and fell, pulling her down with him. She saw the dark stain blossom on his chest, a deeper shadow in the firelight. For a moment, she was paralyzed by a terror so complete it stole the air from her lungs. This cannot be happening. Not again. Then Kiona was there. He seemed to materialize out of the smoke and chaos, his face a mask of grim determination. He ignored the bullets that zipped past him, focusing only on the fallen doctor. Without a word, he hoisted her father over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, a feat of incredible strength. The movement was clumsy, and it exposed his back. Abigail saw the muzzle flash from the roof of the barracks opposite them. She heard the sickening wet thud of the bullet striking flesh. Kiona grunted in pain, his body lurching, but he did not fall. He kept moving, carrying her father the last few feet to the relative safety of the stable wall, collapsing with him into the shadows. Abigail scrambled after them, her mind a numb buzz of horror. The shooting subsided as Cole and his men regrouped, likely assuming their work was done. She knelt beside the 2 men. Her father was unconscious, his breathing shallow and wet. The wound in his chest was grave. She knew with the cold certainty of a doctor's daughter, that there was little she could do for him here. Then she looked at Kiona. He was leaning against the wall, his face pale in the flickering firelight. His hand was pressed high on his back, just below the shoulder blade, and blood was seeping through his fingers. "You are hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is nothing," he grated out, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She knew he was lying. She reached for him, her medical instincts overriding her fear. "Let me see." He tried to push her away, but his strength was failing. She gently but firmly moved his hand. The back of his buckskin shirt was soaked with blood. She had to get the shirt off, see the wound. She tore the fabric away, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. The bullet had entered from the back, a ragged, ugly hole. She did not know if it was still inside him. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to be calm, to be the doctor's daughter he needed right now. She opened the medical bag, her hands moving with a purpose she did not feel. "The bullet is still in there," she said, her voice more steady than she thought possible. "I can feel it, just under the skin. It has to come out, or the wound will fester." She took out a small scalpel and a pair of forceps. She cleaned them as best she could with the carbolic acid. She looked at him, his face a tight mask of pain. "I'm going to have to cut. It will hurt." He met her gaze, his dark eyes filled with a pain that went far beyond the physical wound. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of a terrible vulnerability and an even more terrible trust. He gave a single sharp nod. Her hands were slick with his blood. She held the scalpel, the small, sharp blade seeming impossibly cruel. She had helped her father with 100 such procedures, but she had never been the one to hold the knife. She thought of all the times she had touched him, a brush of fingers when passing a water skin, a steadying hand on his arm. This was different. This was a violation, an act of violence that was meant to heal. She made the cut, her stomach churning at the way his muscles flinched under the blade. He did not make a sound, but a low groan escaped his clenched teeth. She probed the wound with the forceps, her touch clumsy, uncertain. She could feel the flattened piece of lead. She grasped it, and with a surge of desperate strength, pulled it free. It came out with a sickening scrape, a misshapen lump of metal. His blood flowed freely now, and she quickly packed the wound with clean bandages, pressing down hard to stop the bleeding. Throughout the ordeal, he had remained conscious, his body rigid with pain. Now, as she finished, his head fell back against the wall, his eyes closing. The fire from the burning building cast a hellish red glow over them. The world was quiet again, save for the crackling of the flames and her father's labored breathing. She looked at Kiona, at his pale, sweat-sheened face, at the blood on her hands. His blood. Her voice was a raw, broken whisper. "Why? Why did you risk your life for him?" He opened his eyes, his gaze finding hers in the flickering darkness. His voice was faint, each word an effort. "Because in my tribe," he said, "we do not abandon the wounded." He paused, his breath catching in his throat. "Even if she is white." The world after the fire was one of smoke and whispers. Kiona got them moving before the sun was fully risen. A grim, silent specter driven by a will that seemed separate from his wounded body. Abigail's own grief and terror were a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down, focusing on the immediate, desperate task of keeping her father alive. He was a dead weight, barely conscious, his breathing a shallow rattle that tore at her with every gasp. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, Kiona leading their one remaining horse through a landscape that grew steadily less forgiving. The jagged mesas gave way to rolling plains of sagebrush and stunted juniper. Kiona's strength was visibly failing. The back of his shirt was stiff with dried blood, and a feverish glaze had crept into his eyes. Yet he never stopped, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance, a destination that existed only in his mind. He was running on something more than muscle and bone. He was running on memory and instinct. Late in the second day, She heard it first, a low, constant murmur on the edge of hearing. The sound grew into a roar, and the air grew heavy with the smell of damp earth and living water. They broke through a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves shimmering silver green in the afternoon light, and saw it. The San Juan River. It was not a gentle creek, but a wide, powerful artery of brown water, churning with a relentless force as it carved its way through the Red Canyon. It was beautiful and terrible, a force of nature that cared nothing for the struggles of the small, wounded creatures on its banks. "Here," Kiona said, his voice a raw whisper. He slid from the horse, his legs buckling under him. He caught himself against a tree, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. "We will rest here." They made their camp in a small, sheltered cove, a sandy beach protected by a high wall of rock. The river flowed past them, a constant, liquid presence. It felt like the edge of the world. Here, the pursuit of men seemed a small and distant thing compared to the immense, eternal movement of the water. The first few days were a blur of desperate nursing. Abigail's life shrank to the space between two wounded men. Her father's condition was precarious. The bullet had torn through his lung, and every breath was a battle. She used the last of the carbolic acid to keep the wound clean, doling out the laudanum in tiny, precious drops to ease his pain. He was delirious most of the time, murmuring his late wife's name, his hands plucking at the blanket she had laid over him. Kiona was no better. His wound was clean, thanks to her crude surgery, but the fever had taken hold. He would lie for hours, his eyes closed, his body radiating a dry, dangerous heat. She bathed his face with cool river water, forcing him to drink when she could. In those moments, he was not the fearsome warrior or the stoic guide. He was just a man, terribly vulnerable, his life held in her uncertain hands. The roles had been completely reversed. She was now the protector, the provider, and the responsibility was a weight that threatened to crush her. Their supplies were almost gone. The last of the bread grew stale, then moldy. The jerky was a memory. One morning, she woke to a cold camp, the embers of the previous night's fire dead and gray. Her father was shivering despite the blanket. Kiona was asleep, his breathing shallow. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, that if she did not do something, they would all perish here on this beautiful, indifferent riverbank. She had watched Kiona make a fire a dozen times, his movements sure and economical. She tried to mimic him, gathering dry grass and twigs, using a piece of flint from the medical bag and the steel of the scalpel. For an hour, she struck and scraped, her frustration mounting with every failed attempt. Her hands, soft and accustomed to holding books and needles, grew raw and clumsy. Tears of helpless rage stung her eyes. It was such a simple thing, a fire, the most basic tool of survival, and she could not master it. She was about to give up when a spark finally caught in the tinder. It glowed for a moment, a tiny, defiant ember. She held her breath, shielding it with her hands, blowing on it with a gentleness she did not know she possessed. The ember grew, and a tiny lick of flame unfurled, fragile and precious. When the kindling was finally burning, she sat back on her heels, exhausted and triumphant, staring at the flames as if she had created a new star in the heavens. It was her first victory against the wilderness, and it felt more significant than anything she had ever accomplished in her life. That small success emboldened her. She found a length of suture thread in the medical bag and a bent pin. She dug for grubs under a rotten log, her stomach turning at the task, and fashioned a crude fishing line. She spent the entire afternoon on the riverbank, patiently dangling the line in the current, her shadow stretching long behind her. Just as the sun was setting, she felt a tug. She pulled the line in, her heart leaping, and saw a small, silvery fish struggling on the end. It was not much, but it was food. She cooked it over the fire, the smell of it rich and savory in the evening air. She fed the tender flakes of meat to her father, who was lucid for the first time in days. He ate slowly, his eyes following her with a look of pained pride. She then took a portion to Kiona, who had been watching her from his bed of blankets. He ate without a word, but his eyes held a new light, a glimmer of respect that was more nourishing to her than the fish. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself. Abigail became a creature of the river. She learned the best places to fish, the types of wood that burned hottest, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. Her calico dress grew tattered and stained. Her skin darkened under the sun, and her hands became calloused and capable. The town lady, the girl who had recited Byron in her head, was fading away, replaced by a tougher, leaner, more resilient woman she barely recognized. She was no longer just surviving, she was living. As Kiona's strength returned, he began to help her. His wound still pained him, but he could move about the camp. He showed her how to set a simple snare for rabbits, how to find the edible roots that grew near the water. He was a patient teacher, his instructions spare and direct. He began to talk to her, not of his past, but of the present, of the world around them. He taught her some of his words. He would point to the river and say, "Tu." He pointed to the sky. "Ya," to the fire. "Cone." He taught her the word for stone, "tse," and for tree, "tsin." Each word was a gift, a small key to unlocking the world he saw, a world that was alive and filled with meaning in a way she had never understood. She would repeat the words, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar sounds, and he would give a small, rare smile. The tension between them began to change. It was no longer just the shared stress of survival. It was something else, something quieter and more profound. A strange intimacy grew in the small space of their camp, forged in the fire of their shared ordeal. She became acutely aware of him, of the way he moved, of the low timbre of his voice when he spoke her name. She would sometimes look up from her tasks to find him watching her, his expression unreadable but intense, and a warmth would spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. One evening, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a sudden, violent rainstorm swept down the canyon. The wind howled, and the rain came down in cold, hard sheets, turning their sandy cove into a landscape of mud. They huddled under a small rock overhang, the fire hissing and sputtering as the rain found its way through the cracks. Abigail had left a small pile of firewood just outside their shelter, and seeing it getting soaked, she made a dash for it. She gathered the wood in her arms, the rain plastering her hair to her face and soaking her thin dress in seconds. As she turned to go back, her foot slipped on a patch of wet clay. She cried out, her arms pinwheeling for balance. The firewood scattering, she was going to fall. Hard. But he was there. He moved faster than she could have believed, his body intercepting hers. She fell into him, her face pressed against the damp buckskin of his chest, his arms coming around her to steady her. For a moment, they just stood there, locked together in the heart of the storm. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek, the warmth of his body through their wet clothes. The roar of the river and the drumming of the rain seemed to fade into a distant murmur. He smelled of wood smoke and rain and something else, something that was uniquely him, a scent of the earth and the wild. She lifted her head, and their eyes met. They were so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises, the individual drops of rain clinging to his eyelashes. The air between them crackled with a sudden, palpable energy. And then a slow smile spread across his face. It transformed him, erasing the lines of pain and sorrow, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been in another life. The absurdity of their situation. Two fugitives huddled in a storm, covered in mud, seemed to strike them both at the same time. A laugh bubbled up from her chest, a genuine, unrestrained sound of pure amusement. He answered with a low chuckle of his own, the sound a warm rumble against her ear. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was the first time she had truly laughed in weeks. In that moment, They were not a white woman and a Navajo warrior, not a patient and a nurse. They were just two people, finding a moment of shared joy in the middle of chaos. The laughter subsided, but they did not move. They remained in their embrace, the rain dripping from their hair, their breath mingling in the cold air. The amusement in his eyes faded, replaced by something deeper, something raw and questioning. Her own laughter died in her throat, her heart beginning to pound with a different kind of rhythm. The world rushed back in, but it was a world that consisted only of the few inches of space between their faces. She saw a universe of longing in his eyes, a desire that was mirrored. She knew, in her own, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to close the distance between them, to raise her lips to his. The thought was a bolt of lightning, terrifying and exhilarating. But she also saw the fear there, the deep, ingrained caution of a man who had learned that every good thing could be taken away. She saw the ghosts of Bosque Redondo and Fort Defiance, the shadow of Brant Cole in a world that would see this embrace not as a comfort, but as a crime. Slowly, reluctantly, he loosened his grip. She stepped back, the cold air rushing into the space where his warmth had been. The moment was broken. The unspoken question hung between them, unanswered. He turned and began gathering the scattered firewood, his movements stiff and deliberate. She stood there for a moment longer, her body trembling, her heart a wild, confused thing. She looked at the river, a churning, unstoppable force, a barrier between the world she had known and the one she was now in. And she knew, with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity, that she was standing on the wrong side of it, and her feelings for the man beside her were just as powerful, and just as impossible to control. The quiet rhythm they had found was shattered in the dark of a moonless night. It began with a cough from Dr. Whitaker, a dry, rasping sound that quickly turned wet and ragged. Abigail was awake in an instant, a cold dread washing over her. By the light of the dying fire, she saw the dark stain on the blanket he held to his lips. It was blood. The wound in his chest, which had seemed to be slowly mending, had turned against him. His body, weakened by injury and hardship, was surrendering. A fever set in with alarming speed, and by morning, he was delirious, his breath coming in shallow, hitching gasps. Abigail did everything she knew to do. She cleaned the wound again, though her supply of carbolic acid was gone. She bathed his face. She forced water between his cracked lips, but she was like a child trying to shore up a collapsing dam with her bare hands. She was losing him. All her newfound skills, her ability to fish and make fire and survive, were useless against this internal enemy. She was a doctor's daughter, and she was watching her father die, helpless. She sat by his side, holding his hand, the tears she had held back for so long finally tracing hot paths through the grime on her cheeks. The vast, beautiful wilderness that had become her home now felt like a prison, a silent, indifferent witness to her agony. Kiona watched her, his face a grim, carved mask. He had been a silent presence throughout the night, his own healing forgotten in the face of this new crisis. He saw the despair in her eyes, the utter surrender. He saw the life ebbing from the old man who, despite everything, had shown him a measure of respect. He left the camp just after sunrise. He did not say where he was going. He simply disappeared into the cottonwoods, moving with a purpose that frightened her. She thought, for one terrible moment, that he was abandoning them, leaving her to face this final sorrow alone. The thought was a cold blade in her heart, sharper than any grief. He returned in the late afternoon, his hands full of roots and leaves she did not recognize. He carried a piece of bark, which he began to grind into a fine powder using 2 river stones. His movements were deliberate, ritualistic. He built up the fire, placing a small, flat stone at its edge to heat. He boiled some of the herbs in their single tin cup, the steam releasing a sharp, pungent aroma. He knelt beside her father, pushing the blanket away from the wound. He looked at Abigail, his eyes dark and intense. "What I am about to do," he said, his voice low and solemn, "is not from your world. You may not understand, but you must trust me." She looked from Kiona's resolute face to her father's ashen one. She had no other choice. Her world, the world of science and predictable outcomes, had failed. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Kiona took the herbal tea and, lifting the doctor's head, gently poured a small amount into his mouth. Then he took the powdered bark and mixed it with a bit of water to form a thick, dark paste. He spread this poultice on the heated stone, warming it. Then he did something that made her gasp. He drew the knife she had used on him from his belt. He made a swift, shallow cut on his own forearm. Blood, dark and rich, welled up. He let it drip into the warm poultice, mixing his own lifeblood into the paste of bark and herbs. He then took the poultice and spread it carefully over her father's wound, a dark, living bandage. As he worked, he began to chant, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to be a part of the river's murmur and the wind's whisper. The words were in his own tongue, but she did not need to understand them to feel their power. It was a plea, a prayer, a demand sent out to the spirits of the land. He was offering a part of himself, trading his own strength, his own blood, for her father's life. Abigail watched, mesmerized. She was witnessing an act of pure, selfless sacrifice. This man, whom her people called a heathen, was performing a rite of love so profound it made every church sermon she had ever heard seem like a hollow echo. He was not praying to a distant, unseen God in the sky. He was speaking to the earth beneath him, to the water that flowed beside him, to the life force that connected all things. He was giving of himself, not in hope of a heavenly reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do, because a life was in peril and he had the power to intervene. In that moment, she understood. True love, the kind her mother's poets wrote about, was not about whispered words or stolen glances. It was this. It was a willingness to bleed for another. It was a fierce, desperate act of giving. And the only person who had ever shown her its true face was this Navajo warrior, a man whose entire world had been destroyed by her own. He sat with her father through the night, never moving, his hand resting lightly on the old man's chest. Abigail sat opposite him, her own exhaustion forgotten. They kept a silent vigil as the fire burned down to glowing embers. Sometime before dawn, her father's breathing began to change. The ragged, shallow gasps eased, deepening into a slow, regular rhythm. She touched his forehead. The fire of the fever had cooled to a gentle warmth. He was sleeping, a true, healing sleep. Tears of a different kind now streamed down her face. Tears of gratitude so immense they felt like they might tear her apart. She looked at Kiona across the fire, his face illuminated in the soft glow of the embers. He looked back at her, his eyes weary but filled with a deep, quiet calm. He had won. The next day, a gentle rain began to fall, a soft, cleansing shower that washed the dust from the leaves and filled the air with the sweet scent of wet earth. Her father remained asleep, his condition stable. The crisis had passed. That evening, as the rain pattered softly on the rocks above their shelter, Abigail and Kiona sat by the fire. The world felt quiet, peaceful, as if it were holding its breath. The shared ordeal and the miracle she had witnessed had stripped away the last of her reservations, the last vestiges of the world she had left behind. She looked at him, at the man who had shown her the meaning of courage, of honor, and now of love. He had filled the empty spaces inside her, spaces she had not even known were there. He had saved her father. He had saved her. "My whole life," she began, her voice barely a whisper above the sound of the rain. "I have been afraid of what people would think, afraid of doing the wrong thing, afraid of living a life that was not the one laid out for me." She looked down at her calloused hands. "Out here, I have been afraid of starving, of being caught, of dying, but I am not afraid anymore. Not of those things." He watched her, his expression serious, waiting. "Now," she said, looking up, her gaze meeting his. "I am only afraid of going back, of being that person again, empty." She took a shaky breath, the firelight dancing in her tear-filled eyes. She knew what she had to say was a transgression, a breaking of every rule she had ever been taught, but the rules of that world no longer applied. The only truth was here, in this small circle of light, with this man. "I do not want to be a virgin forever," she whispered. The words a raw, honest confession. She saw a flicker of shock in his eyes, a sudden stillness in his body. She hurried on, the rest of the truth tumbling out, a release of a pressure that had been building since the moment he had first offered her water. Not when love finally feels like truth. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than the night, more profound than the rain. Kiona did not move. He simply stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face, looking for any sign of falsehood, of foolish, fleeting emotion. He found none. He saw only the raw, terrifying, beautiful truth of her heart, laid bare before him. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, he reached across the small space that separated them. He did not grab her or pull her to him. His movements were filled with a reverence that made her heart ache. His fingers, warm and calloused, gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a touch that asked 1,000 questions and offered a universe of comfort. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, a shudder of pure, unadulterated feeling running through her. He moved closer, and she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the scent of wood smoke and rain that clung to him. He untied the simple ribbon that held her hair, his fingers deft and gentle. Her hair, unwashed and wild, tumbled down around her shoulders. It was an act of undoing, of setting free. He ran his fingers through it, a look of wonder on his face, as if he were touching something impossibly precious. When he kissed her, it was not with a savage's hunger or a conqueror's pride. It was a kiss of profound and startling tenderness, a soft meeting of lips that was both a question and an answer. It spoke of shared sorrow and mutual salvation, of a solitude so deep it could only be healed by another's touch. It tasted of rain and wood smoke and truth. It was a drowning and a rescue all at once. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, surrendering to the overwhelming rightness of the moment. All the fear, all the prejudice, all the ghosts of her past were burned away in the heat of that single, perfect kiss. He gently lowered her back onto the soft bed of blankets, his body shielding her from the cool night air. Every movement was deliberate. Every touch was a discovery. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw not lust, but a worshipful adoration that stole her breath. There, by the light of a dying fire, with the rain as their only witness, two worlds did not collide. They merged. There was no pain, no fear, only a slow, beautiful joining, a quiet and profound harmony. It was a final act of trust, a whisper in the night that said, "I am yours," and in his answering silence, she heard, "You are mine." They were no longer a white woman and a Navajo man, just two souls finding a home in each other, a single, perfect note in the soft, percussive song of the falling rain. The days that followed were a fragile paradise, a world bounded by the river and the fire, and a love that had been born in violence and terror. A new language formed between them, one of shared glances, quiet smiles, and the simple, profound comfort of a hand held in the darkness. Her father's recovery was slow but steady. The poultice Kiona had applied seemed to work a magic that her father's medicine could not, drawing the fire from the wound. He would sit for hours propped against a rock, watching Abigail and Kiona with a look of quiet, complex understanding in his eyes. He asked no questions. He did not need to. He saw the way his daughter looked at the man who had saved them all, and he saw the way the man looked back, and in his weary, worldly wise heart, he knew that some things were beyond the judgment of towns and laws. The peace was broken by the arrival of a single rider, a young Navajo man who appeared on the opposite bank of the river as silently as a deer. He and Kiona spoke across the churning water, their voices raised in their native tongue, a conversation of sharp, urgent calls. When it was over, Kiona's face was a mask of cold fury. He told them the news. Brant Cole had not waited for the law. He had brought his own. He had filed a claim on a vast swath of territory, including the land on both sides of the San Juan, citing a federal water rights act and a survey map that was, Kiona said, a fiction. He had brought in a dozen hired guns to enforce his claim, building fences and driving off the few Navajo families who lived in the low canyons. He was strangling the life from the land, claiming the water as his own. The battle they had fled had followed them. The world would not let them be. Abigail felt a cold dread, but beneath it was a hard, burning anger. They had found a small piece of truth here by the river, and Brant Cole was going to wash it all away with his greed. "We cannot stay here," Kiona said, his gaze fixed on the river as if he could see the fences and the armed men on the other side. "This is no longer a shelter. It is a cage." "What can we do?" Abigail asked, her voice small against the roar of the water. He turned to her, his eyes dark with a purpose she had not seen since the night of the fire at the fort. He told her of a place he knew, an old, abandoned Spanish silver mine high in the mesas. He said the men who surveyed this land for the railroad were often careless, leaving their records behind. There was a chance, a small one, that a true map of the territory, one that predated Cole's false claim, might be hidden there. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only one they had. It was her father who made the decision. "We have to go back," he said, his voice weak but firm. "We cannot let him win. A man like Cole, if you let him steal a river, he will not stop until he has stolen the sky." The journey back toward Silver Mesa was a tense and hurried affair. They traveled by night, hiding during the day, avoiding the trails Cole's men would be watching. Dr. Whitaker, though still frail, seemed to draw strength from his purpose. Kiona was a ghost in the landscape, his senses on high alert, every shadow a potential enemy. They found the old mine, a dark slash in the side of a cliff. Kiona went inside alone, leaving Abigail to stand watch with her father. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. When he emerged, covered in dust and cobwebs, he was carrying a long, rolled-up piece of oilcloth. Inside was not one map, but two. The first was an old Spanish land grant, its lines faded but clear, showing the river and the surrounding lands designated as tribal territory. The second was more recent, a surveyor's map, marked with the official seal of the United States Geological Survey. It showed the true boundaries of the public domain and, more importantly, it had notes scrawled in the margins, notes that spoke of a rich vein of silver running right through the land Cole now claimed. Cole was not after water. He was after a private silver empire, and stuck to the back of the map, held there with a smear of pine pitch, was a folded, official-looking document. It was a water license, issued to the Silver Mesa Mining Concern, and the signature at the bottom was a clear, unmistakable forgery of the territorial governors. "Here is your truth," Kiona said, handing the oilcloth to Abigail. "This is the only weapon that will work in your world." The plan was simple and desperate. Abigail would take the maps and the forged license and ride to Silver Mesa. Her father would go with her. His word, the word of the town doctor, would lend her story weight. Kiona would not go. His presence would only incite violence. He would take a different path and gather what few warriors he could find, men who had been driven from their homes by Cole's thugs. He would create a diversion, draw Cole and his men out, giving Abigail time to reach the town and present the evidence to the circuit judge, who was still rumored to be in the region. They parted at a high pass, the wind tearing at them, the sky a vast and empty blue. The kiss she shared with Kiona was fierce and brief, a desperate promise in the face of an uncertain future. As she and her father rode down one side of the pass, she watched Kiona disappear over the other, a lone, indomitable figure against the horizon. They were less than 5 miles from Silver Mesa when the trap was sprung. 4 men, materializing from the rocks on either side of the trail, their rifles leveled. They were not the same men who had attacked the wagon, but they had the same dead-eyed look. "Cole wants to see you, Doc," one of them said with a grin. "He has missed your company." Abigail's heart sank. Kiona's diversion had failed, or they had been betrayed. They were led into a narrow box canyon, where Brant Cole was waiting with a half-dozen more of his men. The sheriff's face was flushed with triumph. "Well, Abigail," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Taking a little ride, I have to admire your spirit. But you should know better than to steal from your betters." He nodded to one of his men, who ripped the oilcloth from her saddlebag. Cole unrolled the maps, a greedy light shining in his eyes. "Tisk, tisk, this is private property, trying to jump my claim." "This land does not belong to you," she shot back, her voice shaking with rage. "And that license is a forgery." Cole simply laughed. "In this territory, my dear, what belongs to me is what I can hold, and as you can see, I am holding it all." He threw the maps into the campfire. "Now, we are going to wait here for your savage friend to come looking for you. I have a score to settle with him." They waited for hours, prisoners in the canyon. Her father sat slumped against a rock, his face pale, his strength failing. Abigail's mind raced, searching for an escape that did not exist, just as despair began to set in. A sound echoed from the cliffs above, a high, piercing cry that was not of a bird or a coyote. It was a human voice, a signal. Cole and his men scrambled for their rifles, their eyes scanning the canyon rim. An arrow, silent and swift, sprouted from the chest of a man standing near the fire. He fell without a sound. Then another arrow took a second man in the throat. Chaos erupted. Rifle fire echoed through the canyon as Cole's men shot at the unseen figures on the rim. Kiona and a handful of Navajo warriors appeared and disappeared among the rocks, their bows a deadly counterpoint to the loud, clumsy rifles of the hired guns. It was a battle of shadows and echoes. In the confusion, Abigail pulled her father behind a large boulder, trying to shield him from the ricocheting bullets. The revolver she had taken from home was still tucked in her waistband, a cold, heavy weight. She looked at it, her hand trembling. Suddenly, a mercenary, his face contorted in a mask of rage, broke from cover and charged Kiona's position. Kiona, having just loosed an arrow, was exposed. Trying to knock another, the man raised his rifle, the muzzle a dark, unforgiving eye. He was going to shoot Kiona in the back. Time seemed to slow down. Abigail saw it all with a terrible clarity: Kiona's vulnerable back, the mercenary's aiming eye, the certainty of death. There was no time to think, no time to be afraid. She pulled the revolver from her waistband, the hammer clicking back with an appallingly loud sound. She had never fired it, but she had seen her father do it. She raised it with both hands, the sights wavering wildly. She aimed at the center of the man's back and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming her back against the rock. The shot went wide, but the mercenary flinched, his own shot going wild. The distraction was all Kiona needed. He spun, his bow a blur, and sent an arrow into the man's chest. The man staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and then collapsed. Abigail stared at her hands, at the smoking gun, a wave of nausea sweeping over her. She had just tried to kill a man. She had just saved the man she loved. The two thoughts warred in her mind, a dizzying, sickening paradox. A stray bullet whined past her head, striking the rock behind them. Her father cried out, a short, sharp sound. She looked down and saw him clutching his stomach, his eyes wide with a pain and surprise that mirrored the man she had just seen fall. A new, dark stain was spreading across his simple shirt. "No," she whispered, the word a dry, choked thing. "No, not you." She dropped the gun and fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound. Useless. He looked up at her, his face already taking on a gray, translucent quality. He reached up and touched her cheek, his hand surprisingly steady. "It is all right, Abigail," he whispered, his voice faint but clear. His eyes flickered past her, to the chaos of the ongoing battle, to the harsh, unforgiving landscape. He looked back at her, his gaze filled with a fierce, burning love. "Do what is right," he said, his voice a thread of sound, "not what is easy." His hand fell from her face. His eyes, which had seen so much of the world's pain and had always answered it with kindness, went vacant, and in the middle of the canyon, with the smell of gunpowder in the air and the sounds of battle raging around her, Dr. Samuel Whitaker died. For a long moment, Abigail could not move, could not breathe. The world had gone silent, the sounds of the fight fading into a dull, distant roar. There was only her father's still face and his last words, echoing in the ruined cathedral of her heart. "Do what is right, not what is easy. The easy thing would be to die here with him. The right thing, the hard thing, was to live and to fight." The end of the battle was not a victory, but a cessation of violence. The remaining hired guns, seeing their leader dead and their numbers halved, melted back into the rocks from which they had come, leaving behind a silence broken only by the wind and Abigail's ragged, tearless sobs. Kiona came to her, his own face a mask of grief and exhaustion. He had a fresh wound, a long, bloody gash along his ribs, but he seemed not to feel it. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder, not quite touching, a gesture of profound, helpless sympathy. There were no words for this kind of emptiness. They buried her father there, in the canyon, under a shallow pile of rocks. It was all they could do. As Abigail placed the last stone, she found a folded piece of paper tucked into the inner pocket of his coat. It was a letter, his familiar, neat script covering the page. She did not read it. She could not. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her dress, a last piece of him to hold on to. They were found 2 days later, not by Cole's men, but by a patrol of soldiers escorting a circuit judge to Silver Mesa. The scene they stumbled upon was one of grim confusion, a wounded Navajo man, a grieving white woman, and the fresh graves of several men. Kiona was arrested immediately. Abigail, numb with shock and loss, was escorted back to the town she had fled, a prisoner of a different sort. The trial was a spectacle, a piece of theater designed to legitimize a foregone conclusion. It was held in the saloon, the only building in town large enough to hold a crowd. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume. Judge Harlan, a man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too much of the West's brutal farces, presided from a makeshift bench. The jury was a collection of 12 men Abigail recognized from the town's mercantile and blacksmith shop, all of them men who owed favors or money to Brant Cole. It was not a jury of her peers. It was a council of Cole's cronies. Abigail sat on a hard wooden bench at the front, a witness for the prosecution. She felt 1,000 miles away, a ghost in her own life. Cole, who had spun a tale of being ambushed by a savage war party while trying to rescue the good doctor, sat beside the prosecutor, looking solemn and heroic. He had presented himself as the town's savior, and the town, hungry for a simple story of good versus evil, had believed him. Then they brought Kiona in. He was in chains, his hands bound in front of him. His wounds had been crudely dressed, but he walked with a proud, unbroken dignity that seemed to mock the proceedings. He did not look at the crowd or the jury. His eyes found Abigail, and for a long moment their gazes locked. In his eyes, she saw no blame, no accusation, only a shared, terrible understanding. The prosecutor's questions were a blur. He led her through her story, twisting her words, making her sound like a frightened, hysterical woman who had been captured and manipulated. When she spoke of the attack on the wagon, he suggested it had been Kiona's own doing, a ploy to gain their trust. When she spoke of her father's death, He insinuated that Kiona's warriors had fired the fatal shot. With every answer she gave, she felt the truth slipping away, becoming a distorted, ugly thing in the stale air of the saloon. Cole would occasionally shake his head with a look of pity, as if she were a poor, deluded child. The jury watched her with cold, dismissive eyes. She was a woman. Worse, she was a woman defending a Navajo. Her words were weightless. Despair, thick and suffocating, began to close in around her. Her father's last words echoed in her mind. Do what is right, not what is easy. She had done what was right. She had told the truth, and it was not enough. When the prosecutor was finished, Judge Harlan looked at her. Do you have anything else to add? Miss Whitaker. She stood, her legs trembling. She felt the letter tucked in her dress, a fragile shield against the wall of disbelief. Yes, Your Honor. I do. She pulled out the folded paper. My father knew he was in danger. Before he died, he wrote this. I believe it is his final testimony. I ask that it be read into the record. The prosecutor objected immediately. It is hearsay, inadmissible. But Judge Harlan hesitated. He looked at the faces in the crowd, at the men who had known and respected Dr. Samuel Whitaker for years. He looked at Cole's suddenly tense expression. In a town like this, a dead man's words carried a heavy weight. Let me see it, the judge said. He read the letter, his face impassive. The saloon grew quiet, the only sound the nervous shuffling of feet. When he was finished, he looked not at Abigail, but at the jury. This is the last will and testament of a man this town knew and trusted. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence. I will allow it to be read. He handed the letter to the court clerk. The clerk, a small man with a reedy voice, began to read. To whomever finds this, it began, If you are reading these words, then my time has come, and I have likely met with the foul play I have long suspected was waiting for me. I am of sound mind, and I write this to set the record straight, for the truth is a more potent medicine than any I have ever carried in my bag. The crowd leaned forward, a collective holding of breath. I was not attacked by savages. I was attacked by greed. Sheriff Brant Cole is not a man of the law, but a thief who wears a star. He covets the land along the San Juan, not for water, but for the silver that lies beneath it, a fact proven by maps I have seen with my own eyes. His claim is built on forgery and enforced by hired guns. He is the man who ordered the attack on my wagon, leaving my daughter and me to die in the desert, an act of murder he almost accomplished. A low murmur began to ripple through the saloon. Cole's face had gone pale, his confident smirk replaced by a look of trapped fury. The clerk continued, his voice growing stronger. Let it be known that my life, and that of my daughter, was saved by a man of the Navajo nation named Kiona. He found us when we were at our last gasp and showed us a compassion and honor that I have seldom seen in so-called civilized men. He is not a murderer. He is a hero. He has protected my daughter and me at great risk to his own life, and he has fought only to defend his land and his people from the armed thieves sent by Sheriff Cole. If I die, it will not be at his hand, but as a consequence of the greed and violence that Brant Cole brought to this valley, I ask for no vengeance, only for justice. Do what is right, not what is easy. Signed, Dr. Samuel Whitaker. The silence that followed the last word was profound. It was the silence of a truth so pure it could not be denied. Then, a single voice from the back of the room. A blacksmith whose child the doctor had saved from a fever shouted, "That is the doctor's truth." Another voice joined in, and then another. The murmur became a roar. The men in the jury box looked at each other, then at Cole, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning anger. They had been lied to. They had been used. The foundation of Cole's power, the illusion of his legitimacy, had crumbled into dust. Cole saw it all slipping away. He jumped to his feet, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. He backed toward the door, his eyes wild. "You are all fools," he snarled. But the crowd was no longer afraid of him. They were a single, angry body, surging forward. Several of Cole's hired guns, who had been lounging near the door, saw the tide turn. Their loyalty was to Coyne, not to a disgraced and doomed man. As Cole fumbled for the saloon doors, one of them raised his pistol. There was no malice in his eyes, only a cold, practical calculation. He was cutting his losses. The shot was a single, flat crack that silenced the room. Brent Cole staggered, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He fell forward into the dust of the street he had once ruled, a victim of the same casual treachery he had so often employed. In the stunned aftermath, Judge Harlan banged his gavel, a sound that seemed small and irrelevant, based on the testimony of the late Dr. Whitaker. He declared, "This court finds the defendant, Kiona, innocent of all charges. He is to be released immediately." As men rushed forward to unlock Kiona's chains, the world seemed to tilt and sway around Abigail. The ordeal was over. Justice, a strange and bloody kind of justice, had been done. She looked at Kiona, who was rubbing his freed wrists, his face grim. Then her eyes fell on the sign that hung over the door of the small building across the street. Its paint faded and peeling. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, physician and surgeon. She was an orphan. She was alone, but she was not without a purpose. She had a legacy to uphold. She had her father's clinic, and she had his final words, a compass to guide her through the uncertain territory that lay ahead. She walked out of the saloon, leaving the chaos behind, and stepped into the harsh, cleansing light of the Arizona sun. Silver Mesa did not know what to do with them. In the days following the saloon showdown, the town seemed to hold its breath, caught between its recent past and an uncertain future. The bodies had been taken away, the blood washed from the saloon floor, but a stain remained on the collective conscience. People looked at Abigail differently now. She was no longer just the quiet, bookish daughter of the town doctor. She was a figure of tragedy and legend, a woman who had faced down Brant Cole and won. They offered her condolences that were laced with awe and a measure of guilt, their words fumbling and inadequate. They brought her food she did not eat and offered help she did not need. She moved through it all in a haze of grief, the world muted and distant. Her small house was a cavern of silence, every object a reminder of the man who was gone. His reading glasses lay on the table beside a well-worn medical text. His coat still hung on a peg by the door. The emptiness was a physical presence, a weight on her chest that made it difficult to breathe. Kiona was a ghost in the town's new narrative. He had been exonerated, but he was not embraced. He was a walking, breathing reminder of their foolishness, of the injustice they had been so willing to accept. Men would nod at him awkwardly in the street, their eyes sliding away, unable to meet his steady gaze. He took his meals alone at the hotel, a solitary figure in a room full of uneasy whispers. He spent most of his time at the livery stable, caring for the horses, his silence a wall that no one dared to breach. Abigail and Kiona saw each other, but their encounters were brief and freighted with unspoken words. The easy intimacy they had found by the river was impossible here, in this world of walls and watchful eyes. Their shared ordeal was a secret language that no one else in this town could understand, and it isolated them together. She would see him across the dusty main street, and a jolt of recognition, of profound and painful connection, would pass between them. But then a wagon would pass, or a townsman would greet her, and the moment would be gone. She knew, with a certainty that was a cold ache in her heart, that he would not stay. This town was a cage for him, just as the fort had been. He did not belong here, among the straight lines of the clapboard buildings and the petty rules of men like Cole. He belonged to the open spaces, to the mesas and the canyons and the sky. The day came, as she knew it would. A week after the trial, he came to her house in the late afternoon, as the sun began its slow, fiery descent. He did not knock. He simply appeared in the open doorway, a shadow against the brilliant light. He held the reins of 2 horses, saddled and ready. One was his. The other was the one she had ridden from the river. "I am leaving," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of ceremony. It was not an announcement. It was a simple statement of fact. She had been preparing herself for this moment, but the finality of his words still struck her like a physical blow. She stood in the middle of her father's consultation room, surrounded by the tools of a life she was supposed to inherit, and felt a sudden, desperate urge to smash it all, to burn it all down and run. "Take me with you," she said. "The words a plea, a demand, a prayer." He did not seem surprised. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep and sorrowful tenderness. "Abigail," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips was both a comfort and a wound. "You cannot." "Why not?" she asked, her voice rising with a desperate energy. "What is here for me? This house, this town, they are all empty." She gestured around the silent room. "My world died in that canyon with my father. You are my world now." He took a step into the room, his gaze softening. "I have taught you how to survive," he said, "how to make fire, how to find food, but I cannot teach you how to be one of my people." "I can learn," she insisted, stepping toward him. "I am not the woman I was. I am strong. You know I am." "Yes," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "You are stronger than any woman I have ever known. But it is not a question of strength." His smile faded. "My people live with the earth, not on it. Our spirits are tied to the mountains, to the river. We walk a path that was laid down for us by the holy people in the time before this one. It is a hard path, even for those who are born to it. For you, it would be a prison of a different kind. You would be an outsider, always. You would be a curiosity, a ghost among us. You would lose the person you have become, and I would not be the man who does that to you." "He belongs here," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This is his land, but what about me? Where do I belong?" He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "You belong here," he said, his voice firm but gentle. He nodded toward her father's medical books. "This is your path. Your father, he was a healer. He fought the sickness in men's bodies. You will fight the sickness in their hearts, the sickness of men like coal. You will be a different kind of healer. This town needs you, more than you know." "Our worlds are too different," he said at last, the words she had been dreading. The simple, undeniable truth of it settled over her, extinguishing the last embers of her desperate hope. He was right. She could not live in his world without destroying a part of herself, just as he could not live in hers. Their love, born in a place between those 2 worlds, could not survive in either one. It was a beautiful, impossible thing, like a desert flower that blooms for a single night and is gone by morning. She did not cry. Her tears had been spent in the canyon, on the grave of her father. She looked at this man who had saved her, who had taught her, who had loved her, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it left no room for self-pity. He had given her back her own life, a life she now had to live. She walked with him to the edge of town, leading her horse. The sky was on fire, the setting sun painting the clouds in impossible shades of crimson and gold. The wind, their constant companion in the wilderness, picked up, swirling the red dust around the horses' hooves. The mesas in the distance were dark, sharp silhouettes against the bleeding sky. It was a farewell of terrible, heartbreaking beauty. He mounted his horse, a single fluid motion. He looked down at her, and in his eyes, she saw the river, the fire, the rain. She saw the man who had laughed with her in the storm, and the warrior who had bled for her father. "Thank you," she said, the words simple and profound, "for everything." "There are no words for this in my tongue," he said, his voice low. "There is only a feeling." He placed his hand over his heart. "It will live here, always." She reached up, and he leaned down from the saddle. She put her hands on his face, her thumbs tracing the high, sharp lines of his cheekbones. She pulled him down and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate longing. It was a kiss of farewell, a kiss of profound gratitude, a kiss that held a universe of unspoken hope. It was a promise that what they had shared was real and would not be forgotten. When she stepped back, he straightened in the saddle. He looked at her one last time, his gaze a brand on her soul. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and rode west, toward the burning heart of the sunset. She stood and watched until he was a small, dark figure, a part of the vast and lonely landscape. She watched until the last ray of sunlight had faded and the sky had deepened to a bruised purple, the color of a fading memory. The wind blew cold against her face, but she did not feel it. She felt only the lingering warmth of his hand on hers, the ghost of his kiss on her lips, and the certain knowledge that a part of her soul was riding with him into the great and silent wilderness. The seasons turned, grinding the sharp edges of memory into a smooth, bearable ache. 3 years passed. Silver Mesa, a town that had nearly choked on the poison of one man's greed, slowly began to heal. The wound left by Brant Cole was deep, and the scar it left was a permanent reminder of the town's capacity for blindness. But scars, Abigail learned, were not just marks of injury. They were also evidence of survival. The change was not loud or sudden. It was a slow, quiet turning, like a sunflower following the sun. The federal government, prompted by the circuit judge's scathing report and the discovery of the fraudulent documents, had sent investigators. Cole's land grab was nullified. The old Spanish grant Kiona had found was honored, and the boundaries were redrawn, ensuring the Navajo had access to the river that was their lifeblood. A new sheriff was appointed, a quiet, methodical man who wore his star as a duty, not a crown. The greatest change, however, was in the people. They had seen the truth in Dr. Whitaker's final letter, and it had humbled them. They began to speak to one another with a little more care, to deal with each other with a little more honesty. The fever of quick, easy silver had broken, leaving behind a healthier, if more sober, community. Abigail was the heart of that new community. She had not simply taken over her father's practice, she had transformed it. The small building no longer bore his name. She had painted a new sign herself, in simple, clear letters. It read, "The Kiona Clinic." There had been murmurs at first. Some had called it an insult to her father's memory, others a provocation. But she had held firm. She explained, to anyone who asked, that the clinic was named for the man who had taught her that a healer's duty was to all people, and that true medicine was an act of courage and sacrifice. In time, the town had come to accept it. The sign was a part of their story now, a public confession of their debt, a landmark on their path to redemption. She was not her father. He had been a man of science, of powders and tinctures and neat stitches. Abigail was something more. She still set bones and treated fevers, but she also listened. She listened to the miners' wives who were lonely and afraid, to the ranchers who had lost their herds to drought, to the children who had nightmares of the desert's vast emptiness. She had learned, in the wilderness, that the deepest wounds were not always visible. She prescribed rest and clean water, but she also prescribed hope. She had learned from Kiona that the land itself held a powerful medicine, and she taught people to find it, in the scent of sage after a rain, in the cool shade of a cottonwood, in the resilient beauty of a cactus flower. Occasionally, a Navajo would appear at her door, a woman with a sick child, or an old man with a festering wound. They came hesitantly, their eyes full of a deep, historical mistrust. But they had heard the stories. They had heard of the white woman whose clinic bore the name of one of their own. She would treat them with a quiet respect, using the skills her father had taught her and the wisdom she had learned from the man who had saved him. She would accept their payment of a woven blanket or a handful of wild herbs, and they would leave as silently as they had come. Each visit was a fragile thread in a new tapestry, a slow, patient weaving of two worlds that had been at war for a century. She never spoke of what had happened between her and Kiona. It was a secret garden in her soul, a place she tended with a quiet, fierce love. The memory of him was not a constant ache, but a source of strength, a wellspring of courage she drew from in the long, lonely nights. She would sometimes trace the words he had taught her in the dust. Tu, ya, kon, small. Sacred prayers to a god she had come to know on a riverbank. One day in early spring, when the ocotillo were tipped with flame and the air was soft with the promise of new life, she took a basket and walked out of town, following the path that led to the San Juan River. She went there often. It was her church, her sanctuary. The roar of the water was the only voice that could quiet the lingering echoes of her grief. She was gathering herbs near the cove where they had camped, the place where her world had been unmade and then remade, when she felt it, a change in the air, a stillness, the feeling of being watched. She straightened up slowly, her heart giving a single, powerful thump against her ribs. She looked across the wide, brown expanse of the river, and she saw him. He was sitting on a black horse on the opposite bank, a solitary figure against the red rock cliffs. The distance was too great to make out his features clearly, but she did not need to. She knew the way he sat in the saddle, the proud, straight line of his back, the profound stillness that was more potent than any movement. It was Kiona. He did not raise a hand in greeting. He did not call out her name. He simply sat there, watching her. He was not a ghost from her past, but a living, breathing presence, a silent witness to the life she had built. She could feel his gaze across the water, and in it, she felt no longing, no regret. She felt only a quiet, powerful affirmation. He was seeing her, the woman he had prophesied she would become, the healer. She did not wave or call to him. The river was between them, a symbol of the distance their lives had to maintain. To try and cross it would be to break the fragile peace they had both found. But she could let him know that she saw him, that she understood. She raised her hand, not in a wave, but in a simple, open gesture. She placed her hand over her heart, just as he had done on the day he had left. It will live here, always. A gust of wind swept down the canyon, kicking up a swirl of red dust that momentarily obscured him from her sight. The water of the river sparkled in the spring sunlight, a million tiny diamonds of light. She was not a girl who recited Byron anymore, nor was she the desperate, terrified woman who had fled into the night. She was Abigail Whitaker, a woman who knew her own heart, who had found her own path. She had done what was right, not what was easy, and she had found a life of purpose in the ashes of her loss. When the dust settled, he was gone. She did not know if she would ever see him again. It did not matter. He was a part of her, just as the river and the mesas were a part of her. He was the quiet strength that allowed her to face each new day. He was the memory of a love so true it had taught her the meaning of freedom. She stood for a long time on the riverbank, the sun warm on her face, the basket of herbs forgotten at her feet. She looked at the powerful, churning water, the river that had once been a boundary, a barrier between two worlds. Now, it was just a river, flowing as it always had, indifferent and beautiful and wild. In the end, it was not the river that changed. It was the hearts that learned to flow. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.